In the last episode of Demystifying Kubernetes Networking, we learned about Linux network namespace and its relevance in Kubernetes. It's the Linux network namespace that gives Kubernetes pods the needed network isolations and at the same time enables the containers inside a pod to be able to talk with each other. But how does Kubernetes implement this? Because pod in reality is just a logical construct. How does it work on the machine? That's a question we are going to explain in today's episode. Hello, I am Sanjit and welcome to my channel. In today's episode of Demystifying Kubernetes Networking series, we will learn about a critical container which is often hidden out of our sight but plays a very critical role in binding the Linux network namespace. POS container, Kubernetes secret recipe. Let's start with a small experiment. Log into one of the nodes of a Kubernetes cluster and spin a new pod. In this case, it's the Nginx pod that we are trying to launch. Next, let's try to investigate Nginx pod manifest. The pod manifest has one container and that's Nginx. A docker ps -a for the Nginx container should ideally lead to showing only one container, that's Nginx container we saw. But in the output we see an additional POS container, which is started by Kubernetes under hood without our knowledge. What are these POS containers? Did you ever notice it earlier? Did you know what are these for? We start with setting of a context on what is a Kubernetes pod. A Kubernetes pod is a set of containers which share some features. One of the most important of these features is the network namespace. They can also share some directories of files, a volume in the Kubernetes world. All containers within a pod run on the same underlying host node in order to allow for the various shared features. From a container perspective, a pod is not particularly significant. Containers are still generally isolated from one another even within a pod, except for the network and IPC namespaces and whatever volumes mounted in the common between them. Rather, a pod is important to higher level control as it exists as the smallest deployable unit of work which can be managed by Kubernetes. POS container is a container which runs a very simple process that does nothing but sleeps all the time. The purpose of a POS container is to keep it alive for use by other things. Why would you want to keep a container which does nothing alive? The idea is to be able to have named namespaces, which seems rather redundant until you realize that Docker doesn't really expose a whole lot of low-level controls of these things. Instead, it simply creates a new namespaces for each container that it runs. If you want to share namespaces with Docker, you reference an existing namespace by its container's name, not its namespace ID. So when Kubernetes needs to use a common namespace among components, it runs a dummy container to create namespaces which it can then reference using the name of that container. This is where the POS container comes into the picture and makes a lot of sense. Now that we understand the significance of a POS container in Kubernetes, let's think what will happen if the POS container gets deleted. We will see this in action with the same Nginx pod which we have spun some time back. Let's stop the POS container now. As you could see, the POS container is no more running inside the Nginx pod. After some time, Kubernetes will restart this container and we see this now. Did you notice the container ID of Nginx has also changed, indicating that stopping of POS container led to restarting of the other business app container as well. When the POS container gets deleted, Kubernetes thinks that the entire pod is unavailable even though there are other business containers in the pod which are up and running. Because of this, Kubernetes will recreate the entire pod. As you could see in the output of kubectl describe pod of Nginx, it clearly shows the pod sandbox changed, it will be killed and recreated. Well, that's all I had for this episode of Demystifying Kubernetes Networking. Hope you all liked it as much as I did while making this. Thank you.